Well, welcome everybody. I'm glad to open this briefing on JPPI's 2020 annual assessment of the situation and dynamics of the Jewish people. We are holding it at a time when the world is upside down, and as we approach Yom Kippur, we pray for a better year, and I wish you all Shana Tova and Gmar Chatima Tova. This year's annual assessment covers a full scope of issues, challenges, and opportunities for the Jewish people and is framed between the two starkly contrasting poles. The bad news of 5780 was the eruption of the global pandemic, which is having a critical impact on the Jewish people and Israel, which is entering the second lockdown to address a second and dangerous wave of the virus. The good news, which gives us some hope for better years to come, is the new peace agreements with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. These agreements pave the way for more to come and for creating a new axis of cooperation between Sunni states and the Jewish people. This is an opening for a warming relationship with Egypt and Jordan, which signed peace agreements with Israel decades ago. I welcome Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, JPPI's co-chair, who will add his remarks to the briefing, and as well, and his counterpart, Ambassador Dennis Ross, who will be joining us during the meeting and conclude with some words of his. As my retirement approaches, I would like to thank everybody who accompanied me in this amazing journey and gave me the honor of making a modest contribution to the future of our people. And of course, next year, that will be somebody else who will open this meeting. Now I would like to introduce our senior fellows who will give the briefing. The first part on the geopolitical landscape and the impact on the Jewish people and Israel will be led by Ambassador Avi Gil, former Director General of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The second, conducted by the Annual Assessments Project Head, Shmuel Rosner, will discuss some of the other main developments in the Jewish world. And last but not least, Dr. Gitit Levy-Paz will present her work on cultural creativity, focusing on the international popularity of Israeli television series. We are working on how the creative arts are forging connections between different parts of the Jewish world. And in the future, we will also consider the impact of Jewish creativity in the diaspora on Israelis. Following our presentations and Ambassador's Eizenstat remarks, we'll open the floor, and I am inviting now Dan Feferman, who will moderate the session to explain how this briefing will work. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you, Avinoam. Good morning to everyone in the United States and North America. Good evening to everyone here in Israel. And I'll say before Avi offers his presentation, you'll be able to ask questions through the chat function, and you can address those either to Inbal or to myself, and we will be happy to include those questions at the end of the presentation. I'll give the floor now over to Avi for a brief geopolitical survey. Avi?
Thank you, and Shana v'chatima tova for everyone. While formulating the geopolitical annual assessment, we place special emphasis on those developments that may, for better or worse, affect the Jewish people as a whole. The few minutes at my disposal, of course, do not allow me outlining the full geopolitical picture of the past year, so I will touch on 5 key points that seem most significant to me. The first point is the geopolitical ramification of the COVID-19. The past year was rife with challenges and uncertainty even before the COVID-19 crisis erupted. The pandemic carries multi-systemic impact: health, economic, social, security, etc. It has intensified pre-existing uncertainties. Due to the enormous damage, Israel will have to contend with the challenges it poses with much fewer resources that it once possessed. The potential implication of the corona crisis for the geopolitical arena raises serious questions. How will the global economy be affected? Will the global balance of power shift? Should we expect social unrest, a growing number of failed states? What will the future of globalization be? Will we witness a rise in nationalism and growing tendency toward closed borders? And of course, how will the crisis affect the Middle East? The answer to these questions have implications for the fate of Israel and the Jewish people. For example, globalization and free trade are well suited to the comparative advantage of Israel's export-oriented economy. A more protectionist world order could harm Israel, which currently benefits from its participation in free trade zones with the US and the EU. Likewise, the vitality of Western Jewry owes much to the predominance of liberal democratic values. A society that is not committed to those values will tend to manifest more hostility and anti-Semitism and feel less obligated to protect its Jewish minority. Here in our region, the pandemic's negative economic impact may accelerate social and political trends that threaten Middle East stability, already rife with war, terrorism, refugee waves, humanitarian crises, stagnant economies, corruption, unemployment, and failed governance systems. Israel needs to be prepared for the possibility that economic pressures will tempt some rulers in the region to deflect the domestic agitation in Israel's direction. The second point has to do with the world order and the international status of the US. This year, too, we have seen more destabilizing global developments. The rise in power and assertiveness of autocratic China and Russia, the continuous erosion of the liberal democratic ethos, the dwindling American interest in world leadership and Mideast involvement. Particularly troubling in this regard is the degree to which US international stature is eroding. The US is the superpower's friendship and support are critical to Israel and also home to a thriving community that amounts to half of world Jewry. This trend could lead to a gradual erosion of Israel's deterrence and the strength attributed to it. In this context, we are faced with a crucial question. To what extent will the results of the US coming elections affect the world order? Will a change of administration, if it happens, be only in style or also of essence in regard to US role on world stage, the attitude toward international institutions, NATO, the nuclear agreement with Iran, the level of involvement in the Middle East, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and more. The third point has to do with the threats and the opportunities facing the Middle East. Israel's power and advanced capabilities, the Iranian threat, Islamic terrorism, and the challenge of exploiting and protecting the Eastern Mediterranean gas reserves have led to a convergence of interest between Israel and the major Sunni states, and to growing security cooperation between them. The most significant manifestation of this was Israel's historic peace agreement with the United Arab Emirates and later with Bahrain. in exchange for suspending Israel's plans to annex territories in the Judea and Samaria. As more Arab states follow the path paved by the Emirates, the strategic and historical significance of the agreement will intensify. However, this welcome achievement does not free Israel from the political, security, demographic, Jewish, and moral challenges posed by the lack of solution to the Palestinian issue. The crisis on the Palestinian side has intensified over the past year. Major diplomatic defeats, painful cuts in international aid, never-ending divisions, and growing internal tensions over the possibility of change of leadership. This unstable situation could lead to a security deterioration. The light and shadows of the strategic picture show that Israel's strength does not guarantee the resolution of the fundamental strategic problem it faces. Chronic Middle East instability make it necessary to prepare for violent flare-ups vis-a-vis Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria, as well as in Judea and Samaria. US sanctions and the damage of its corona crisis have not so far led Tehran to give up its effort to achieve military nuclear capability, nor to abandon its regional subversions. Iran, in its view, has an open account to settle with Israel and the US. The prevailing view is that Tehran will wait for the results of the upcoming US election to decide what to do next. Hence, Israel needs to be prepared for both the possibility of US-Iran negotiations and the possibility of intensified Iranian aggressive operations, perhaps to the point of full military confrontation. A significant point that required attention is Erdogan's aspiration to establish Turkey as a regional power and ideological leader of Islamic world. This can be seen in Ankara aggression, involvement in conflict hotspots across the Middle East. The fourth point has to do with Jerusalem-Washington American Jewry strategic triangle. The deepening ideological polarization in the US and Israel's transformation into partisan issue have harmed the triangular relationship, which is a major factor in the strategic stature of Israel and the Jewish people. Maintaining bipartisan support for Israel has become more complicated in a reality in which President Trump announcing that Jews who do not vote for his party don't love Israel enough. The challenge is intensified by the fact that large sectors of America Jewry, many of whom disapprove of significant elements of Israel's policy, are hostile to Trump and support the Democratic Party, while the vast majority of Israelis see him as a great friend and prepare his election victory. The last point has to do with solidarity as a component of strategic power. The principle that all Jews are responsible for one another is an essential factor in the power equation of the Jewish people. Weakened intra-Jewish solidarity could make it more difficult to unify forces in an hour of need. Intense trying times of COVID-19, we see how critical intra-Israeli solidarity is for strategic national resilience. Let me end with a personal note. During the Six-Day War, as a 12-year-old boy, I remember very well how I listened with great worry to the propaganda broadcasts from Cairo that promised to throw all the Jews into the sea. But I also remember how the immense solidarity that prevailed in Israel in those days, the deep feeling that we are all one family, diminished the fear and gave confidence to all of us. Unfortunately, we lack the solidarity of 1967 today. Our leaders must act to bring it back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Avi. We'll now go to Shmuel Rosner, who headed and coordinated the annual assessment project, who will give an overview of everything except for what Avi just talked about. Shmuel, please.
Hello, everybody. Shana Tova. It's good to see you. As was said, I had the annual assessment project, which means that everybody else does the work, and I get the credit for it. So most of what I'm going to show you is highlights from the work that other people at the Institute did. It's great scholars and fellows thought about these things, and I will just pick and choose some highlights that can, from each, hopefully we can all benefit. And of course, I'll recommend that you go online to the JPPI website, where you can find the full annual assessment with the many chapters and sub-chapters, and then you can read whatever you're interested in more detail. So I begin with the four of the 5 gauges that we traditionally present at the outset of the annual assessment. The 5th gauge is the geostrategic gauge, and Ambassador Gil just spoke about the geostrategic arena, so I'm not going to expand on it. But of the other 4 gauges, I chose a few highlights that I think are worthy of looking at when we are where we are today, at the midst of a global pandemic with all its ramifications and complications. So beginning with demography, Professor Uzi Rebhon, who does most of the work on demography at JPPI, highlighted 3 important things that we should look at as we think about the pandemic and its implications. Item number 1 is people moving to Israel. We already see such phenomenon of mostly returning Israelis, but also of other people coming to Israel. This was more significant at the beginning of the wave of the pandemic, when Israel seemed to handle the pandemic better than other countries. Of course, today we are not seen as glorious as we've been seen back then. Still, we have to take into account the possibility of more people moving to Israel, making aliyah as a result of the pandemic, of economic hardships, or of course, because of anti-Semitism in other places. The second point is people leaving Israel, again, because of the same reason, mostly because of economic hardships. If Israel fails to handle the pandemic properly, the economic situation can deteriorate, and then we might see people deciding that Israel is not the best place for them to live in. And the last item, and it's, as interesting as it is, we don't know much to say about this, except that we know from history that pandemics have a tendency to have impact on fertility trends in different countries. This can be a rebound for changes in the construct of the population. It can be because of economic reasons or other reasons, but we know that fertility trends can change because of things such as COVID. And especially in Israel, Israel is an outlier on fertility in the Western world. We are a country with very high fertility compared to most other Western countries. And if the pandemic is going to have to change this trend, this could be meaningful for the Jewish people. Moving to the second gauge of resources, This is handled mostly by Professor Stephen Popper from California. And I would highlight, again, a few things from the annual assessment. One is the importance of pooling resources when there is a crisis, of focusing on the crucial things that will enable the Jewish community to get over the pandemic and come land strongly on the other side of it when it ends. The second point is the need to think about our new normal. We tend to believe that the pandemic is going to change some things in the world, maybe permanently so. Of course, some of the things that we see today are going to go back to the old normal. Hopefully, coffee shops will be one of them. But there are other things that might change forever, and we need to think both about changes that we cannot control and also changes that we can think about and that might be preferable for us, and that the pandemic is an opportunity for us to bring about.
Shmuel, excuse me for interrupting, Shmuel. One of our guests is asking if you could just explain what DTMPT stand for on the outside of the gauge.
Oh yes, these letters are explaining from left to right. These are from bad to better. So D at the one end is deteriorating, and at the other end, the T is, well, Avinoam probably remember the exact terms, but it's from bad to better. When the middle, the M is the middle, is the term that describes a situation in which we are pretty much in the middle. So so when the clock moves, or when the gauge moves from P to M, this means that we are in a slightly worse situation than last year. Obviously, with resources, the pandemic made us look less stable than in previous years. For most other gauges, you see no big changes this year, maybe slight changes. I'm moving to the third gauge, the one of bonds between communities. So again, we have the pandemic to think about. The pandemic has a positive and negative impact. On the positive side, it brings us together, closer together. It enables us to think about the ways Jews and Jewish communities can help one another. We see Israel trying, with limitations, to assist smaller Jewish communities. We see, of course, large communities in the United States and other places assisting smaller communities. So this is an opportunity for us to come together and forget for at least some time about our differences. On the other hand, we see the pandemic as something that is a huge disruption for the regular tempo of Jewish life. And the main feature that we see is the ceasing of travel, whether it's programs like Birthright that cannot happen during the pandemic, but also just Jews going back and forth between communities, meeting with one another, having conferences not through digital media. All these things cease to exist, and of course this is not good for bonds between communities. And the last point, I'm not going to expand about it because I don't want to get too political, but of course, with 3 elections behind us in Israel, 1 election before us in the United States, and possibly, I'm afraid, another election in Israel not long after the US election, the bonds between communities fall victim to a highly politicized situation, a highly politicized discourse. This is not good for Jews who want to talk about things that make us want to talk about things that are less controversial. The highly political atmosphere in both in Israel and the United States, the two main pillars of the Jewish world today, is disruptive to the flow of Jewish goodwill. The last gauge, identity, I would talk about, again, disruption in the continuity of Jewish practice. This is not just about travel. This is what we call the move from physical Judaism to digital Judaism, the move of synagogues to having to hold their high holiday services on Facebook or via digital media, the whole transition of communities, whether it's federations, synagogues, organizations, think tanks, and other places to digital activities is, again, there is an opportunity here. There is also a disruption here, and we need to ponder these two things and come up with ideas as to how we come out of this stronger than before. The second point I'd like to talk about is the growth of anti-Semitism. I'll say a few words about this in a second. And of course,
if you could conclude with this, please, Shmuel. Thank you.
Yes, I will. And of course, the last point I'd like to say about the gauge of identity is political orientation. One of the things that are highlighted in the annual assessment by Dr. Shlomo Fisher is the tendency of many Jews in the world today to see their Jewish identity through the prism of political orientation. And of course, when we move from the cultural arena to the political, social arena, and people see their identity through such prism, this could become a disruptive force in our Jewish life. The one additional slide I'm going to show is the one about anti-Semitism, and this is the one point I'd like to highlight. The work on anti-Semitism at the Institute is vast. It is led by Dr. Rabbi Dov Maimon, and I would urge you to go and read the whole chapter. But our grim conclusion, we said it last year, we have to say it again this year, our grim conclusion is that the short respite the Jewish people got from anti-Semitic phenomenons around the world following the horrors of the Holocaust, this short respite seemed to come to an end. And what we have to come up with is not just strategies how to combat anti-Semitism in our attempt to go back to a more positive atmosphere, but we also have to think about ways with which we can live alongside anti-Semitism. This is going to accompany us for the coming years and decades. This is not an encouraging thought, that it's something that we must consider and must prepare for. So I will conclude here, and if we have more time later, I can highlight more points from the annual assessment, which of course I urge you to read. Thank you, Shana Tova.
Thank you very much, Shmuel. I'll once again say, if anyone has questions, they're welcome to send them in a direct message to me, and I will include them either during the presentation or most likely after the presentation. We'll now go to a brief presentation by Dr. Gitit Paz-Levy. Gitit? Unmute yourself, please.
Hi, sorry. So hello and Shana Tova. The main cultural phenomena, or one of the main ones in the Jewish world and especially in Israel today, is the rise of Israeli television and more precisely of Israeli TV drama series. Enormous Israeli series are sold to foreign networks and broadcast all over the world. Two of the most prominent, Fauda and Shtisel, have enjoyed great international success. As part of the Institute's interest in Jewish and Israeli culture, the project Gone Global, the acceptance and influence of Israeli television in foreign markets, examines this phenomena, the rise of Israeli series, and the various consequences of it. So the study main questions are: what impact do Israeli series broadcast overseas have on the image of Israel, viewers' knowledge of Israel, the connection to Israel, and to the Jewish identity of the viewers? What is the difference? What is the different impact on Jewish and non-Jewish viewers? And which kind of Jewish learning takes place through watching the series? So in order to answer all these questions, the study goes to the series themselves, and the study is based on a qualitative analysis of the series and articles, reviews written about them. Another main element of the study is taken from the posts and conversations in the international Facebook groups devoted to Shtisel and Fauda. These groups are very active and lively and include thousands, sometimes hundreds of posts published every month. The largest group, Shtisel, let's talk about it, has more than 20,000, around 23,000 members, and it's global. It's like you have participants from the United States, from Canada, Australia, Africa, Germany, Israel, and even in the Fauda group you can find from Arab countries like Lebanon, Egypt, and others. The group constitutes a database of critical information, and many hundreds of posts have been read and analyzed for the study. Also, a survey of 500 respondents, serious viewers in the United States, was conducted on social media, particularly in designed groups related to Israeli television and series. The sample is not representative. It is important to emphasize that. It's not representative of American viewing audience or American Jewish population. It also includes non-Jews, as I said before. But nevertheless, it does offer additional insight into serious viewers, which are active on social media. And most of the respondents were American Jews. Around 80% of them were Jews, and around 20% were American non-Jews. So I would like to speak briefly about some of the findings. And first of all, in terms of knowledge and learning about Israel. So the Israeli series influenced the viewers' level of knowledge about Israel and their connection to it. People write about a first encounter with Israel, with the ultra-Orthodox population, with the Israeli-Palestine conflict. People describe a feeling of learning, an Israeli experience, discovering Israel. They compare it to studying or traveling to a new place, to a new culture. And this is mostly about non-Jews. When we speak about Jews, we can see a much stronger benefits. So we can speak about reinforcing Jewish identity. For Jews, the Israeli series represent more than a journey of discovery in regard to Israel. For some, the connection to Israel is a central component of Jewish identity. And then for the TV series meet a Jewish identity need. For Jews who strive for a significant connection to Israel in their daily lives, the series represent a convenient opportunity to reinforce this connection. One of the participants in Shtisel Facebook's group wrote to me in a personal correspondence that watching Israeli television shows connects people to Israel, it sparks the Jew in everyone and brings them closer to the roots. I ran out of time, I guess, so I see Dan is kind of pressuring me here. So I just want to give the last finding, which is very important point. We found that watching Israeli television series has the effect of strengthening attachment to Israel among American Jewish viewers. And also we found that a positive impact, a strengthening of their connection to Israel as a result of watching the series becomes more evident the stronger the connection to Israel was to begin with. So we are still checking it, and these days we are trying to check with more than these 500 respondents to see if this is actually the direction, but there is definitely a connection, and we can see that watching this series connects the viewers to Israel and make them feel more positive about Israel.
Thank you very much, Gitit. And once again, we encourage everyone to go into our website, JPPI's website, and download the annual assessment, whether in English or in Hebrew. I'll also just point out, for those who are interested, the letters on the gauge represent decline, troubled, maintaining, prospering, and thriving. I remind you once again, if you have questions, you're welcome to send them to me in the chat function. And we'd like to invite our co-chairman of the board, Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, to offer a few words.
Thank you. I'm glad you defined the letters. I was about to do the same. Well, first, let me say that what is unique about JPPI is the array of scholars we have across the ideological spectrum from left to right, but also across the religious spectrum from secular to ultra-Orthodox. We really cover the waterfront. Second, this annual assessment is a truly unique publication. There is no other institution in Israel or anywhere else in the world that takes this kind of kaleidoscopic view of the health of the Jewish world as JPPI does. Third, in normal times, Dennis Ross and I, along with Avinoam, and usually Shmuel or one other person, will present this report to the Israeli cabinet and the prime minister. And we're given an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours to make the presentation. This is published initially in Hebrew. Of course, we're seeing the English translation, but that indicates the impact that this annual assessment has. Fourth, and then I'll double back to the assessment itself, we produce an enormous array of very important and timely papers. Everything from an in-depth look at U.S., Israel, China relationships and how Israel is caught between the two superpowers, with the U.S. being the most obvious strategic and economic partner, but with China being the second largest trading partner of Israel. We look at U.S.-India relations, and we did a major paper and hosted a major conference in which I participated with the Indian ambassador to Israel just before Indian Prime Minister Modi's historic trip to Israel, the first time an Indian Prime Minister had done so. And India will soon be the most populous country in the world and is the third largest purchaser of Israeli arms. So these are the types of products that we put out in addition to this unique net assessment. Now, having said that, I know that Ambassador Ross, my co-chair, is going to be joining shortly, so I don't want to in any way steal his thunder from some of the geopolitical factors. But let me perhaps deal with a few of the other dimensions of Jewish well-being that are noted here. First, in terms of resources. As you can see from the needle, going from prospering to maintaining, the COVID crisis has been a major crisis in terms of the provision of resources. The Jewish Agency has made difficult cuts. Jewish community centers and Jewish federations have had to make very difficult reductions. And so the impact on Jewish resources is a very, very real one. One of the things I think that will help Israel is that even with its own now second wave of coronavirus, it has technologies which can help developing countries deal with COVID and with other challenges, water, desertification, and so forth. And it can therefore broaden its capability through its own resources, technological resources. A second comment is on demography. And here, frankly, I would have moved the needle toward maintenance, toward a more negative view. And the reason is that quite apart from the issue of Aliyah to Israel or the movement of Israelis out, the fact is that the fertility trends in the diaspora, in contrast to Israel, are entirely negative. Our families have below replacement levels of children. Replacement level would be, just to stay even, 2.1 an average children per family. We're well below that. And I do not believe, Shmuel, in any way, shape, or form, that the COVID crisis will lead, as perhaps other pandemics have, to an increase in fertility, even though husband and wife are at home. The reason is it has been such a struggle for two-earner families to try to work from home and keep kids who have not been able to go to school, that any potential fertility boon, I think, if anything, it will be a negative trend. Third is on identity. And here, again, I'm very concerned about a potential deterioration. We have a situation in which well over 50% of all marriages involving a Jewish spouse in the United States are with a non-Jewish spouse, and only in 10% or less of those cases does the spouse convert to Judaism. And when there's no conversion, the percentages of families with children whose children will identify with Judaism commensurately declines. So we have a really structural, systemic problem. We have to do much more outreach to those families. We have to make them feel welcome. I think even perhaps radically, we have to have rabbis being willing to officiate, at least not Orthodox rabbis, at mixed marriages if they will commit to some minimal Jewish education before the marriage and to raise their children as Jewish. So I think the long and the short of it is that this demographic challenge is very great. You're fortunate in Israel that it's not, and that you actually have over 3 children per couple, but in the diaspora, it's very serious, and it's not just the US, it's all throughout Europe as well. I hope that Dennis is here. If he's not, I'll be glad to talk about the geopolitical, but again, this is his forte. So do we know if Dennis is here? If
yes,
not,
Dennis has joined us, yes.
Okay, so Dennis, I'll lateral to you.
Okay, thank you. Look, I apologize for coming on late, and unfortunately, I have another Zoom that I have to take part in at noon, so I'll just make a couple of comments. Look, this is on the one hand, with the breakthrough between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain, we can see Israel's place in the region changing in a fundamental way. And it doesn't remove the Palestinian issue, and the Palestinians can't be wished away. And there are issues related here, I would say, to how to think about the Palestinian issue for Israel, and not to think in terms of we won and they lost, because the fact that they're not going away still requires Israel to think through what it will do, but also how it can take advantage of what is this new opening in the region. And understand there is a new strategic alignment, there's a new landscape that says the region is very different, and some of the traditional assumptions about nothing is possible until you solve the Palestinian issue, that also has to be rethought in light of what is changing. We're now seeing that there are Arab countries in the region who will decide that their national interests supersede the concern with the Palestinians, that the message to the Palestinians is that you will not be in a position where you can freeze the region and prevent others from doing what they see as being in their national interest. How the Palestinians will respond to that, at this point, it's not encouraging, but it seems in many ways they're also waiting to see what happens with our election. What happens with our election has implications across the board, for sure, but I would note there's one issue on which there is probably not a whole lot of disagreement, and that is on China. And I raise that, and we raise it in the assessment and also in the introduction that Stu and I have done. Israel's going to need to have a different approach. Right now, it's caught between the US and China. That's unlikely to change very much regardless of the outcome of the election. There needs to be much more of a kind of clearinghouse within Israel that can then work with a kind of mechanism with the United States that also focuses on the do's and don'ts of what will be permitted. The Israeli-China relationship is an important relationship, certainly economically. The concerns here about China's involvement with infrastructure in Israel, the concerns here with technology transfer and development that creates potential problems, these are issues that can be sorted out, but they need to be sorted out. And it's going to be, I think, an important priority for Israel when it faces the U.S. in 2021, regardless of whether it's a second administration of the second Trump term or whether it's a Biden administration. There will need to be an approach that sort of deals with this. And I think that has to be a kind of high priority. I mean, overall, in terms of looking at Israel's geopolitical position, one thing is clear, that the effort to isolate Israel has failed. And it turns out it's failed not only internationally, but it's failing even in the region. That will have implications for the BDS movement. The idea of trying to delegitimize Israel is going to become certainly more difficult in an environment where more Arab states are developing relations with Israel, and there will be more. Maybe not the big ones, but you will see Sudan, you will see Oman, and you'll probably see other states that begin to take partial steps towards Israel. After all, in the case of the Emirates, bear in mind, this was a relationship that was being developed over the last, really more than the last decade. They made a decision to normalize fully, even though they had been moving in that direction anyway. The reason they did it was because of the Prime Minister Netanyahu's declaration about annexation. If it hadn't been for his readiness and determination to move towards annexation, the Emirates would not have come with the initiative to the administration. It was the Emirates' initiative, it was not the administration's initiative. The administration was still trying to use the threat of annexation to get the Palestinians to come to the table, and were telling conveying in messages to the Palestinian Authority through Palestinian intermediaries that if they didn't come to the table and at least engage on the Trump plan by September, annexation would go ahead. What the Emirates did is they came in and they offered the administration a win for its diplomacy by showing its diplomacy was working. They offered, in the end, this gave Prime Minister Netanyahu also the ability to say he had a win and that his policies were producing this. And of course, they got a win for themselves not only because they actually do want a relationship with Israel across the whole commercial, economic, scientific set of sectors, but also they will now get F-35. They will get other advanced equipment that they have been denied because of the American commitment to preserving Israel's qualitative military edge. So they help to change the reality, and others are going to follow suit, and it will have, as I said, a set of clear messages to the Palestinians who are still in a state of shock by this, haven't figured out how they're going to respond to it other than by now seemingly reaching out to Hamas. I think the biggest challenge for Israel with the Palestinians is going to be making certain that we don't see a collapse of the PA, making certain that we don't see much greater instability as a result of what are now increasing numbers of COVID and the consequences also of stopping security coordination and not accepting the monies that Israel collects for it. So generally on the geopolitical front, I would say that Israel is clearly in a better position than it was with more outreach in the region, with more normalization, with Iran at this point not having changed its policies, but being dramatically weaker than it was, at least because it's weaker domestically, but also the place where it has had influence, it's also under direct criticism for the nature and the failed model that it represents. We now have Shias, not the militias, but Shias in Iraq demonstrating against Iran. We have the same in Lebanon. So what Iran represents may still be a threat, but it is a weaker threat in the region than it was. Iran too hasn't quite figured out how to respond to the normalization with Israel and what it reflects in the region as a whole about what the future of the region ought to be. So there is good news there, but it's always good news in the Middle East is always tempered by a set of concerns. I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Dennis, and thank you, Stu, for your wise words. Are there any questions people would like to offer? You can contact me directly in the chat function. We give the thinkers and typers just another minute here if people would like to ask any questions regarding anything that was mentioned or anything in the annual assessment. Stu, you'd like to ask a question, please. Let's unmute Stu and Bo.
So I'd like to just add one other element, which is discussed in the assessment on geopolitical, and then also get Dennis's comments before he has to go off. And that is one of the factors we look at in the geopolitical, beside the UAE, Iran, and the other things that Dennis summarized so well, is what we call the triangular relationship between the US government, the Israeli government, and the American Jewish community. And here we have a real, I think, concern. And that is there is enormous support for President Trump in Israel, for moving the embassy, for recognizing the sovereignty of the Golan Heights, for the UAE and Bahrain. There is at the same time enormous antipathy by perhaps 70% of the American Jewish community toward President Trump. And to the extent that the Israeli government constantly warms up to President Trump, and obviously every prime minister should have good relations, but it appears to be almost adjunct for the Republican Party, that fissure can grow. Already polls show that majorities of Democrats have greater sympathies for the Palestinians than to Israel. So this is something to be watched, and I think a very real concern. Israel must, Avi mentioned this at the beginning, but it shouldn't be just rhetoric. It has to make itself, as it's traditionally been, a point of bipartisan support, not partisan division. Again, Dennis may have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would just, look, I completely agree. In some ways, if the real challenge will be if Trump wins a second term, because then, it becomes harder for this Israeli government, and we don't know how long this Israeli government will be there, but it becomes harder for this Israeli government to act in more of a bipartisan fashion. And if we have another 4 years of it's not acting in a bipartisan fashion, the longer term consequences here, I think, will be that Israel will lose its fundamental, I think it'll lose a position that it's always had here. And I think with long-term consequences. Should Biden be elected, Israel will have a kind of natural pretext to be reaching out much more to the Democrats. And I hope that it will move quickly to take advantage of that. Again, the context for Israel has been changed here. It's true, the progressive part of the Democratic Party has taken their cues from the Palestinians in terms of their reaction to the breakthrough with the UAE. But the majority of the Democratic Party has embraced the normalization and seen it for what it is, that it's a very positive development in the Middle East that promises a different kind of peace. It's not going to be the cold peace of Egypt and Jordan. And that too will have implications in the region. And I think that too will have implications here. So the point of losing bipartisanship, which is, for me, has always, and I think Stu and I both subscribe to this, it has been the anchor of the relationship. Political parties can change in terms of attitudes. It used to be the Democrats who were always the natural supporters more than the Republicans, but Israel made a real effort to have a connection to both. And the loss or the declining connection to the Democrats will have a long-term consequence for the relationship. And unfortunately, I need to leave. Sorry to come in late and then have to leave so early, but I hope that the discussion was a good one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis. We do have one more question, but we'll go briefly to Avinoam because I believe he has to go. And I will take this opportunity while he's still here in the name of all of us at the Institute and all the friends of the Institute to thank Avinoam for his many years of service and leadership and contribution to the JPPI and to the Jewish people. And we wish you all the best of luck. So we'll go to Avinoam for concluding words, and then we will come back to a question we had from the participants.
I just really wanted to thank everybody for participating. It was a wonderful group of supporters here, and I see Sandy Beckler, and I saw Charles Bronfman is here, and of course Eric Goldstein took from his busy schedule some time for us, and Steve Hoffman and many other, Mark, Ute, I see on the screen. So thank you everybody. Thank you for those great years of support and of cooperation. And well, we'll have probably an opportunity to see each other in the near future, maybe. But for now, to Michael Siegel too, to Dick Hirsch, I see on the screen. So thank you, everybody. It's a great journey, and I'm really proud for the time that I had the honor to be together with you.
Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate you taking your time. The report in English and in Hebrew is available for download on our website. Once again, thank you to all the Institute fellows and staff for their participation in this. Thank you once again to Avinoam for everything he's done for us over the years. I wish everyone a Shana Tova, a happy new year, Gmar Chatima Tova, and a meaningful and easy fast for those who do so on Yom Kippur. Take care, everybody.